The committee will come to order. The chair notes the presence of a quorum. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I, the chair announces that he may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote is ordered. I recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining us to discuss the Committee on Natural Resources Authorization and Oversight Plan for the 118th Congress. As we think about the function of authorization and oversight, I think it's a very important constitutional duty as members of Congress to carry that out. And we all may have a different idea of what that means, but I was hoping Ms. Ledger-Fernandez would be here. She and I both attended a university that had a motto of Lux et Veritas, and that means light and truth. And really, that's what we're looking for when we talk about oversight. We want to shine light on the actions of the administration, and we want to find out the truth of what's going on with the administration. That's regardless of if it's a Republican or Democrat administration. It's Congress's duty to have oversight over those in the administration. We're, in my opinion, failing our constituents and our country when we do not have that oversight. And as representatives, we swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. And as I mentioned, a key part of our duties and responsibilities are in conducting essential oversight of the federal agencies. Without regular, rigorous accountability, federal bureaucracy remains a black box to the American people, and it runs a significant risk of waste, fraud, and abuse. Thus, we're here today to consider the committee's authorization and oversight plan, which will help ensure laws and programs addressing subjects within our jurisdiction are being implemented and carried out in accordance with congressional intent. I believe our entire authorization and oversight plan contains valuable insight into the focus of our committee's oversight, but for the sake of time, I'll just highlight a few of the main priorities. First, this committee will investigate the Biden administration's war on American energy and get answers on delayed projects ranging from pipelines to onshore and offshore leases to outdated permitting requirements. As always, we will follow the science and use data-based analysis to inform our oversight. The world has an insatiable appetite for energy, and it's imperative that we unlock American resources and allow them to meet that demand. And that's American resources for both conventional energy and new forms of energy, which I know that we're interested in that on both sides of the aisle. Second, we will modernize our regulatory framework and bring it into the 21st century. You'll hear witnesses from every sector, including renewable energy, testify how outdated laws like NEPA hamstring important projects and keep communities from achieving economic success. Under the current scenario, we're shooting ourselves in the foot with our own laws and hurting America's competitiveness and security on the world stage. We'll be shining a light onto these laws that haven't been updated in decades and making them work for the American people, not the other way around. And I've said this before, we all breathe the same air, we all drink the same water. We want to protect that. We want to make sure we practice good conservation and leave it better for the future. But we're in an untenable situation where we can't do virtually any projects anymore because of the overburdensome regulations. We will be conducting robust oversight into the administration's conflicts of interest. I sent numerous letters last Congress seeking materials on various officials' ethics compliance, yet we have received little to no information. This kind of murkiness surrounding unelected officials will not continue, and we'll use every tool at our disposal to get answers. Finally, we will be taking full account of how the Department of the Interior and other agencies are spending their money. Laws like the Great American Outdoors Act and the Inflation Reduction Act have funneled unbelievable amounts of money to the federal government with little to no oversight or accountability as to how the funds are utilized. It's extremely irresponsible for Congress to just push that kind of money out the door and call it a day. We'll be tracking those programs, seeing how agencies are utilizing taxpayer funds, and ensure they're going towards programs that benefit American communities instead of lining bureaucrats' budgets. I know I speak for many of my colleagues sitting here when I say our constituents are deeply concerned at the lack of oversight and accountability within the federal government. As far as our committee is concerned, we will seek to turn that tide. When government operates in the shadows, we have no way of knowing how our money is being spent. I look forward to using our oversight capabilities to strengthen Americans' environment and economy, promote access to public lands and natural resources, and enhance conservation through innovation. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. As members of the House Natural Resources Committee, we're charged with historic, undeniable, and consequential task of protecting our planet from climate change and improving the quality of life for our communities and for the generations to come. The Authorization and Oversight Plan proves that committee Republicans are not yet ready to meet that charge or, frankly, accept or understand the challenge before us. I do have to credit my colleagues' plan for finally acknowledging that something must be done about the single most profound issue of our era. However, that something leaves much to be desired. In particular, the plan includes a brief mention of climate change, I think twice in the Oversight Plan, and offers solutions, and I quote, of improving cattle grazing practices and planting trees as the primary solutions to deal with this consequential issue of climate change. They're nice ideas for discussion if you're just now joining the conversation. But 25% of our nation's carbon pollution comes from our public lands, and yet this plan contains no serious prescription for reducing the fossil fuel drilling behind that pollution, and shouldn't be and can't be taken seriously. Not only does the plan fail to address the climate crisis and environmental injustice, but it also tries to roll back the progress Congress made over the last 2 sessions of Congress. Instead, the plan is an oil industry to-do list. The American Petroleum Institute's annual report lays out their wishes, and the committee's plan dutifully promises to carry them out. Increase disaster-prone drilling off our coasts? Check. Increase the destructive drilling on our public lands? Check. Attack the environmental reviews of major projects? Check. All of this happening while the oil companies are price gouging the American people. ExxonMobil raked in $58 billion in profit in 2022, while complaining loudly about how we haven't given away enough public lands for them. For Shell, it was $42 billion in profit. ConocoPhillips, $19 billion. Each of these represented an increase of profits over 2021. Too much is never enough. And don't be surprised if part of the energy policy of the majority on this committee will be to deal with the issue of royalty relief for these poor, impoverished corporations and big oil companies in America. The plan for this committee should address climate emergency with urgency and seriousness. The plan should put forward a serious effort to ensure that indigenous people and the communities on the front lines of environmental harm have seats at the table in federal decision-making. It should foster the political self-determination and economic development of our U.S. territories. It should conserve our natural resources by promoting ocean health, protecting wildlife, safeguarding irreplaceable landscapes, and preserving our public lands and ensuring clean air and water. And it should build an economy that works for everyone. No matter how much oil and gas we produce here, it'll always be vulnerable to a global market, which allows faraway dictators to cause price shocks across the world. Clean, domestic, renewable energy is the future for energy independence. Today, my colleagues and I will offer some amendments to try to make the proposed plan into a document worthy of the committee, worthy of its jurisdiction, and worthy of its historic role, and worthy of the American people. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The business before the committee today is the consideration of the Committee Authorization and Oversight Plan for the 118th Congress. Copies of the plan were circulated to members' offices in accordance with the committee's notice requirements. Without objection, the plan will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. As we consider this plan today, and I was listening to the ranking member, and I think we have some common ground here where, he did talk about our plans for reducing carbon through good forest management. He said a number that I hadn't heard before, that 25% of carbon emissions come from public lands, if I understood that correctly. But I think we've got a great opportunity to do more for the environment than maybe any other committee in Congress, because we know that if we keep our forests healthy and keep them from burning, we're locking carbon up in our forests. We know that if we're growing more trees, we're sequestering more carbon and actually pulling it out of the atmosphere. And we also know that American producers of fossil fuels do it cleaner and safer than anybody else in the world. We have the best environmental guidelines. The consumption of energy in the United States, as well as the rest of the world, is going one direction, and that is up. And today, fossil fuels still make up the vast majority of that globally. So they're not going away. We need to figure out how to make them cleaner and safer, or quit demonizing them, and I think there's innovation and technology that can do that. So I look forward to those rigorous debates and discussions as we talk about American energy, and not talk about giving relief to corporations, but giving relief to American citizens who are seeing increased energy costs across the board. Those are great discussions that we will have as we move forward in this Congress, and I know many of you are anxious to have those discussions. We'll now open it up if any member wishes to be recognized for debate on the plan before we get to amendments.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stauber, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I rise today in strong support of our Authorization and Oversight Plan. Our constituents elected us to the House, and our peers picked us to sit on the House Natural Resources Committee. It is incumbent upon us to ensure strong stewardship of taxpayer dollars and ensure the agencies under our clear jurisdiction are accountable to the American people. The Energy and Minerals Resources Subcommittee has a broad and deep authority over statutes and agencies governing coal, oil, and gas leasing, hard rock mineral programs, and permitting. And as a reminder to this administration, leasing for oil, gas, and coal is the law. Their refusal to follow the Mineral Leasing Act at the behest of the anti-mining and the Keep It in the Ground lobby is harmful to our energy security and the pocketbooks of our constituents. We will also make clear to the American people why our mineral supply chains are controlled by China and other foreign adversaries. This administration is actively choosing to source minerals from countries known for child slave labor instead of from our own borders. America won 2 world wars with the natural resources mined in northern Minnesota. If we are to continue leading the world in all sectors, we will again need to leverage the vast mineral wealth in my district and a mining workforce that stands ready, able, and willing. I am also seated on the Federal Land Subcommittee. I am proud that my neighbor to the east, Mr. Tom Tiffany, is my chairman of Federal Lands. Wisconsin's 7th District and Minnesota's 8th have a significant federal land footprint. While most of the attention is well-deserved on Western issues, pressing federal land problems in Wisconsin and Minnesota are long overdue. My district alone counts for 99% of Minnesota's federal land footprint. We are proud of our resources and want them to be used for the betterment of our constituents and not just a playground for the rich. I am eager to hear more from this administration on their 30 by 30 land grab and how their differing messages over the last few years have made their intentions even more nefarious. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anybody else wish to be recognized? There's no further discussion on the plan. It's now in order to consider amendments on the committee authorization and oversight plan. Are there any amendments on the plan?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment.
I recognize the gentlewoman from Puerto Rico for the purpose of offering her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is clarifying and technical in nature. Paragraph 3 of page 11 clearly stipulates that as part of our oversight responsibilities, our committee will review fundamental issues facing each of the U.S. territories. However, the title of this paragraph references the Office of Insular Affairs. While our committee does have jurisdiction over the Office of Insular Affairs, not all territories are under that office purview. Unlike the rest of the insular areas, Puerto Rico is not under the jurisdiction of the Office of Insular Affairs. And just to clarify this, my amendment simply strikes the reference to the Office of Insular Affairs and changes the title of the paragraph to read as Oversight of the Insular Areas. This will help avoid any confusion and ensure consistency with our underlying plan to review important questions and matters impacting each of the 5 U.S. territories. Additionally, my amendment strikes paragraph 6 of page 11, which mentions our intent to review the implementation and actions taken under the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA, and instead move that reference as the new sentence at the end of paragraph 3. PROMESA is one of the many topics on Puerto Rico our committee will continue reviewing, but it's not the only one. Therefore, rather than having it as a separate item, I believe it will be more appropriate to include PROMESA under paragraph 3. I'm not changing the content of the amendment, just making the reference under paragraph 3, along with the other territorial topics our committee will oversee. As I just described, this amendment simply makes a couple of technical clarifications. It does not change the intent nor the underlying oversight plan we have laid out as a committee for the insular areas. I therefore support this amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read.
Mr. Chairman?
Are there others who wish to?
Yes, I'd like
Mr. Grijalva, you're
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In addressing the gentlelady's amendment, we really don't have any serious problem with it, and would ask the chair to consider unanimous consent to approve the amendment.
Without objection, so ordered.
I second the motion.
Now recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for the purpose of offering his amendment. And without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This amendment fills a glaring gap in the majority's authorization and oversight plan. As I stated in the opening statement, the single most pressing issue affecting every single one of us every single day is climate change. But it seems as though my colleagues across the aisle still think it can be ignored, if avoided, and in some instances outright denied. In the majority's entire oversight plan, climate is mentioned only twice, once in a section railing against the U.S. Geological Survey's climate science programs, and once in a reference to a dubious solution dealing with restorative grazing. Insufficient climate solutions like restorative grazing, a talking point that has been borrowed from Big Ag. Not including climate change as a major component of this plan is a blatant disservice to the American people, especially those who live in communities that are being hit the hardest by climate change, and that is before us every day in the news and in our own communities. As my amendment points out, our public lands and waters, which the committee oversees, are a critical piece of the climate solution. Nearly a quarter of this country's carbon pollution comes from fossil fuel production on public lands. Reducing emissions and prioritizing clean, renewable energy on public lands could be a huge step forward toward our country's climate goals, yet the majority apparently has no serious plans to do anything about that. Our oceans absorb around a quarter of the entire world's carbon pollution. Oceans also capture 90% of the excess heat generated by carbon pollution. Yet the majority has no serious plan to keep our oceans healthy and thriving. Our committee has the ability to deliver real climate solutions to communities that have been overburdened by climate change, including poor communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, and the U.S. insular areas. In particular, this very committee championed the passage of major climate investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act last Congress, which will deliver billions in climate action resources to the American people. But this majority has no plan to keep that momentum going. In addition, this committee has the ability to elevate traditional ecological knowledge and practices of indigenous people who have interacted with America's lands and waters since time immemorial. This body of knowledge can be a huge asset to public land and water management practices, as we've heard at our hearings on tribal co-management last year. Yet this majority has no plans to elevate indigenous knowledge or practices any further or to pursue the co-management alternative. So to make sure the American people overwhelmingly want Congress to do more about the climate crisis, are getting the action that they deserve and desperately need, this amendment addresses these shortcomings of the majority's plan and adds a new section on climate change and climate action. This committee can't wait around 2 more years to continue our work on climate. I urge support of the amendment, and Mr. Chairman, yield back the balance of my time.
Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Ranking Member Grijalva for offering this comprehensive amendment. You know, looking at the majority's oversight and authorization plan as written, we really should just call it what it is. It is an extractive industry wish list, and it is completely disconnected from the real world. It's as if those poor oil and gas companies who are struggling through record profits, obscene profits, more than 500% year over year in some cases, need help from the Congress and from this committee. They've just been struggling through those stock buybacks, and it's been so hard on them that we need to dedicate all the work and the priorities of this committee to their continued profits. Let me outline a few of the most egregious aspects of this plan. The chair referenced the fact that it refers to climate change only twice. And one of those times is to rail against science-based government climate programs. The other is to pay lip service to natural climate solutions like planting trees, which I'm happy to work with the chairman on, and innovative grazing practices. That's it. Folks, we've got a climate crisis that has already displaced millions of Americans, many more around the globe. It is threatening the livability of this planet, and this is the best you can do? I mean, let's get real. Planting trees is well and good. And Mr. Chairman, if we can talk about that in a way that doesn't simply promote plantation-style industrial tree farms and actually does what the science tells us we should do so that forests can help solve the climate crisis, and that starts with protecting old-growth trees. The chairman knows this. He knows more about trees than anybody else in the Congress. Then we'll have some good work to do together. But if it's just a stalking horse for extractive industry and attacking our bedrock environmental laws, we are going to have a lot of conflict. Now, 62% of American adults say that our government is doing too little to address climate change. Well, this plan not only ignores it, it would make it worse. If we're going to get serious about tackling the climate crisis on this committee, we need to start being real about fossil fuels. We need to keep our fossil fuel reserves in the ground. We need to aggressively pursue renewable energy solutions on federal lands and waters. Democrats did that with the biggest climate investment in history with the Inflation Reduction Act, but Republicans want to take us backward. Now, making matters worse, nowhere in the 13 pages of this plan is the phrase environmental justice. Now, when we held the gavel, we knew our job was to show up and work to represent the American people, not just those CEOs and shareholders of big oil struggling through their stock buybacks and suffering with those 500% profit increases. In our work here, we need to recognize that oil and gas and mining projects don't just happen in a vacuum. They often happen in the backyards of our communities, and it's no accident that most of those EJ communities are poor, black, or brown. In my district of Northern California, there are over 24 federally recognized tribes and even more that are unrecognized. Many of them are small, under-resourced, and we on this committee need to be sticking up for their health and for their rights and cultural identities, as well as ensuring that they're treated with the respect they are owed as sovereign nations in matters of government-to-government consultation. This plan badly misses the mark on that front. The ranking member's comprehensive amendment would inject some much-needed logic and reason into this authorization and oversight plan. It would outline how the committee plans to act on climate by reducing carbon emissions, aiding impacted communities, elevating traditional ecological knowledge, pursuing ocean-based climate solutions, and ensuring the best available climate science is used. Unfortunately, we all know Republicans will vote this amendment down. And I want to ensure my colleagues and certainly our constituents that as we go forward, I am personally committed to pursuing these science-based and community-forward objectives. I look forward to working with our stakeholders and anyone else in Congress, as well as the Biden administration, on that path forward. And I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment and no on the underlying proposal. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too would like to thank the ranking member for offering this amendment. As someone who comes from California, albeit an urban part, we have a state that is dealing with drought and wildfires almost every single day of the year. Those used to be seasonal issues, but not anymore. We know that our lands are heating. We know that our oceans are heating because of human activity. And I would hope that that would also be included in this plan, because I am sure that farmers and our fisheries, not just in California, but across this country, would also be equally interested in that issue. And climate change should not be a partisan issue. It should be an issue that all of us are invested in, given the fact that we use and partner with the land on so many things that keep all of us alive and employ so many millions of Americans. I also would hope that we would have a much more robust discussion about drilling and oil extractions and permits. There are thousands of permits that have already been approved that have not been used. And so to want to offer more of them seems like a handout to big oil. Before that happens, can we look at the data? Can we look at why we have given so many permits, what they are being used for, how much oil is being extracted as a result, what else we could be doing, and what is the goal? The goal should not be giving away all of the land. This is especially important to me because I have one of the largest oil fields in an urban area in my district. And when I go to town halls, I hear constituents share stories of 7- and 8-year-old girls and boys that now have plates in their heart because of the toxicities that they are ingesting because they are living next to oil fields in the district. We should be including these issues, these stories in our plans as well, because it is as much about energy and clean energy as it is about making sure that humans are able to survive on the land in which they're living. And just lastly, when we're talking about wildfires and grazing and land management, I would hope that we could also include in this plan indigenous communities who have generations and generations of experience in healing and partnering with the land, especially as it relates to wildfires. And I certainly believe that those practices should be included and integrated into this plan. And lastly, as we talk about our insular affairs as it relates to climate and climate change, I did notice that we have some elements in this plan around the well-being of folks on our indigenous communities that are on federal lands. I hope included in that, we're also talking about issues such as conversion therapy practices that are still being done on indigenous folks on those lands and how that is compromising their ability to thrive and also participate in all of these conversations. So I too would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote for this amendment so that we can have something that's more inclusive of the issues that are impacting Americans. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Anybody else wish to be recognized? Mr. Bentz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I listen to the folks across the aisle talk about today's piece of business, the Authorization and Oversight Plan, I fear they haven't read it. And if they had, they would see that many of the points they're making have been addressed in this not comprehensive, but certainly a good start toward what this committee should be doing. And I want to draw the committee's attention to some of the parts of this plan, which I think, if we come back to what's going on, I think my colleagues across the aisle are focused primarily when it comes to climate change on mitigation, as opposed to sequestration and adaptation. You can't just focus on mitigation. One of the reasons is that the United States, of course, is one of the smallest contributors to the issue of CO2, and the bigger issues are not within our control. So what we should be doing is exactly what this plan suggests, and that is, let's focus on how we're going to adapt to a changing world, one that we do not necessarily control. So mitigation, yes, it's happening, but adaptation, sequestration, hugely important. And to that end, I would like to draw folks' attention, because it was the last thing we heard about tribes. And I would just go to the last couple of pages here and talk about, point out, apparently, because these paragraphs haven't been read, tribal forestry under Indian Affairs. And of course, it's somewhat familiar to me because I'm from Oregon and I'm working with some of our tribes on exactly the kind of concepts that were being remarked upon as though they weren't in this plan, but they are. And natural resource management, of course, 56 million acres that Indian tribes have authority over. Of course we want to focus on those. I'm going to go back to water because, of course, thanks to you, Mr. Chair, enjoy the chairmanship of that particular subcommittee. And I just want to say that increasing water supply is hugely important. And it was interesting to me as I listened to Congress folks from the great state of California, how they ignored the damage being done to hundreds of thousands of low-income folks in the Central Valley when the water was taken away from them so that they didn't have jobs. What the heck? And the water being run down the mountains and into the ocean for purposes having much to do with the type of pollution that the more populated areas of California are creating. And so yeah, you might point at the smelt, but I would point at the people and say that's why the water's not going into farming where it would be employing literally thousands of low-income people. So yes, of course I want to talk about water supplies on that subcommittee. Of course I want to talk about the Colorado River Basin. This issue is one of, again, adaptation to a more dry climate. Why do you think it's in here? Of course we're going to be talking about it, and I enjoyed meeting with those people yesterday, although what a challenge. And of course, look at this, protecting and promoting hydropower. Folks across the aisle want to take out dams. At the same time, they're busy talking about having more clean power. I look forward, Mr. Chair, to having a discussion about hydropower and its dramatic importance when it comes to balancing intermittent power, which is what solar and wind is. Without hydro, you have to resort to, more gas peaking facilities. Mr. Chair, I could literally go through every paragraph and call out the frailty of this amendment that's been suggested, which I oppose. I recommend everybody vote against it. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for a quick question?
No, I won't. Thank you. Yield back to Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. I speak in support of this amendment, and I thank Mr. Grijalva for introducing it. I'd like to point out, first of all, that this amendment, as I understand it, does not strike a single word from the plan that the majority has put forward. It is purely additive. So even though, as Mr. Huffman points out, many of the items in the plan read like a fossil fuel industry wish list, not all, but many, we're not striking any of that or proposing to strike any of that. If those are things that the majority wants to investigate, to inform policymaking, fine. what Mr. Grijalva is proposing is additive. Why not expand the scope of our investigations, our research to inform our policymaking by making climate change not a footnote, but a focus of this committee? I represent Rhode Island. The Narragansett Bay has risen 6 inches in the last 30 years. Coastal communities like those I represent are on the front lines of climate change. And we are seeing already in my state, in my district, the impact of climate change on property owners, on commercial fisheries, on farmers throughout our district. Why not expand the scope of what this committee investigates and considers to make sure that when we talk about energy production, we are doing it in a way that incorporates environmental concerns, climate concerns, so that we can advance the best possible policy for the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? I oppose this amendment for 2 reasons. Mr. Bentz mentioned one of those. It's unnecessary. If you read the plan, we already cover these issues and many of the same goals that are outlined in the Authorization and Oversight Plan. And number 2, it just it resurrects old ideas on the Green New Deal and the Blue New Deal, policies that the majority have pushed in the last 2 Congresses, and with the unified government, the House, the Senate, and the White House, they were unable to pass these policies. And, this is what I expected. I expected you all to come in and say we're creating an extractive industry wish list, that it's all about big oil. I wouldn't have expected any different, but I can tell you that's not what it's about. As I said earlier, we're wanting to make sure that our constituents are heard, that people who are suffering from high energy prices, whether those prices are from fossil fuels or from electrons generated by wind and solar, the cost of energy in this country is extraordinarily high right now. And we're going to have oversight of that.
Mr. Chairman, could I just ask whose time you're speaking on right now?
This is my time. I have not spoken.
On the amendment, I apologize. Yeah, thank you, sir.
Maybe I need to claim a few more seconds for being interrupted, but so I look forward to, as Mr. Bentz mentioned, talking about the facts and the data. And, there's this talk about climate, and Republicans don't care about climate. Republicans have no ideas. I cannot wait to talk about the facts on climate and to have a rigorous discussion on that. And, the current minority's solution has been electric vehicles. And I'll tell you what, I'll take natural climate solutions with forest health, with things that we're proposing to produce domestic energy. I'll put that up against electric vehicles any day of the week and twice on Sundays. And I can't wait to get the data out here to talk about that, but that'll be for another hearing. And again, I oppose this amendment. We've got this covered in the plan, and we will look forward to vigorous oversight of this administration and over the policies of this government. With that, is there any further discussion? Mr. Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to Mr. Huffman.
I appreciate the gentleman from Hawaii, and I just wanted to follow up with Mr. Bentz. I couldn't help but notice you said the United States is one of the smallest contributors on the CO2 problem that is warming the planet. Maybe the gentleman has different sources of information than me, but my understanding from all of the science is that if you look at the historic CO2 pollution that has caused this unsustainable concentration of CO2, we are far and away the largest nation in terms of carbon pollution. In terms of current emissions, my understanding is that we are second only to China. So I just want to ask the gentleman, what source of information do you have that would be so dramatically different than that?
You're yielding to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you notice I didn't say anything about historical in my remarks. It's today that counts. You can go back if you're interested in reparations and trying to figure out how to offset that which has happened in the past, if you wish. I would suggest, though, while you're doing it, you need to take into account the advances that were made by virtue of.
But the source, I asked you about the source.
Let me finish. It's very easy for people to look back and say, hey, you know, you the United States, created all of the CO2 and ignore that which was created by the use of those resources. Why is that?
Do you disagree that we're the #2 emitter even today?
Okay, remember.
Do you disagree?
Wait. Remember, I said 20% of the total emissions. Total. So if you take China and India and the other third world nations that really don't have a heck of a lot of choice when it comes to what they're doing, unless you're suggesting that the poor people in those communities shouldn't have light, shouldn't have power, shouldn't be able to cook
I
things.
thank the gentleman. Reclaiming my time, I think that the challenge here is understanding a fairly obvious fact when it comes to carbon pollution and the climate crisis. That historic pollution is what is heating the planet today. It's not about reparations or guilt tripping. This is about what is heating the planet today. And if we stopped emitting entirely today, and we haven't, believe me, we got a long way to go there, we would still have a huge responsibility to tackle the problem we created with those historic emissions. It's not about wokeness. It's not about anything else. It's about an existential threat to the livability of this planet and the obligation that we have to solve that crisis. I yield
Will
back.
the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
So I would ask the gentleman, what are we going to do about the carbon that's in the atmosphere today? You all made light of the fact that we're talking about natural climate solutions. To my knowledge, there's nothing that takes carbon out of the atmosphere other than plants through photosynthesis. So when we talk about natural solutions and healthy forests,
We're going to have our tree conversation, aren't we?
we'll have a great conversation on trees and on using natural solutions and on innovation. So I appreciate the gentleman.
I welcome the gentleman's engagement on this, and I respect his knowledge on trees and forests. But as you and I have discussed several times, the science shows that if you really want to use trees as part of the natural solution, which I'm very interested in, you got to start with protection of the ones that actually sequester carbon, and that's the old growth. And that's what's always missing from these proposals, these largely cosmetic kind of industrial extraction proposals. And I will say that the gentleman has kind of tiptoed into old growth in terms of the sequoias of California, but it's always with the Trojan horse of let's attack NEPA in order to save a few sequoias. So I think we've just got it. We will have a great conversation about this. It'll be substantive, it'll be science-driven, and I look forward to it, but beware of Trojan horses. And I yield back.
We will beware of all Trojan horses. Anybody else wish to speak on the amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. A roll call is requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, for the purpose of offering her amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In this report, it does seem, well, first I want to acknowledge that after a long history of various individuals in the body denying the existence of climate change, I do want to say that it's very encouraging to see that there is some acknowledgement of the climate crisis here in the report. But when we look closer, it does seem that it's only mentioned about twice, once to criticize climate science at the U.S. Geological Survey, and once in a section offering scientifically dubious solutions. But in the report, there is a failure to acknowledge the disproportionate impact that these changes have on communities of color and other frontline communities, many of whom are all of our constituents. So I'm proposing an amendment that would require the collection of public health data and other impacts of new drilling on federal lands. My colleagues say that opening more of our federal lands to fossil fuel development is what their constituents want and need. I'm not here to I'm not here to dispute that point in this moment. But I will say that surely, if that is the case, then there should be no objection to gathering better data on the health impact of these policies on the health and safety of everyday Americans. So I truly believe this is a common sense amendment that would help protect and inform the American people, especially the most vulnerable among us. And I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Would anybody else like to be recognized to speak on the amendment? Mr. Rosendale, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, how can you ignore that emissions have actually gone up during this administration? How can you ignore the millions of people around the earth that have had clean water, indoor plumbing, lights, electricity provided to them, making their lives better, literally extending their lifespan, lifting them out of poverty by having access to electricity that's been provided by coal, oil, gas, or other fossil fuels? It simply can't be ignored. Their lives are better, their lives are longer as a direct result of that. So to sit there and say that we should be trying to eliminate these fuels is absolutely absurd, ridiculous. The desire by this administration to shut down our domestic energy production is causing prices to escalate, forcing Montanans to make difficult decisions about heating their homes or simply putting food on their table. And those are facts. Many people overseas are harvesting the remaining timber that exists in their country, having access to, in order to burn firewood, in order to heat their homes. This is bad for the environment and terrible for those who are forced into those situations. Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle have been extremely selective about when they would like to use science-based information. How about if we start using science-based information about managing the population of grizzly bears in the state of Montana, which populations are at 300% and 400% of the target populations, so that we can delist these animals? How about if we use science-based information and allow the state of Montana to continue to manage our wolf populations, which are 10 and 12-fold beyond the target populations? And how about if we allow forest management practices that would prevent millions of acres from burning each year, absolutely ruining air, land, and water quality across the state, across the nation, and start using some best management practices on how to take care of those forests, which would not only help keep our air, land, and water clean, but it would also help the economy, provide jobs, and be better for everyone who's connected with it. For all of those reasons, I will be opposing this amendment. Thank you very much.
Chairman.
I will yield the balance of my time to my friend from Wisconsin. Thank you.
I would just, if I may, pose a question to the gentle lady. When you use I think the term is impact that is in your amendment. When you say impact, does that include doing a rigorous study of the positive impacts? Is it looking at both sides, that there has been effluent, there have been emissions, and we need to account for that, but there's also been benefits. When you say impact, do you mean both sides, positives and negatives?
Thank you. And will the gentleman yield?
Mr. Chair, I would yield an answer to the representative from New York.
Yes, I'm not sure if there's confusion about the substance of the amendment, but the amendment is specifically about an assessment on the health and safety impact. If there are practices that are revealed to have positive health impacts on the communities, on impacted and frontline communities, I do not dispute the inclusion of any positive health impacts. I believe that we should have information on things that may improve people's health, but of course, there is a large degree of concerning information about the potential health impacts, breathing impacts, cancer exposure, et cetera. And this amendment is not saying stop drilling. This amendment is not speaking to that issue in this moment. This amendment specifically speaks to the collection of data of health and safety on frontline and vulnerable communities that would be nearby these sites.
May I use a balance of the time, gentlemen?
I yield back the balance of my time to Representative Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate the answer. I will not be able to support this amendment because there was a but in there in the answer that came from the lady who offered the amendment, and it is not focusing on also the good things that could have happened as a result of, we have life expectancy in a little over a century here that went from 50 years to into the 70s. Infant mortality was 1 in 10 100 years ago. It is not anywhere near that. So I don't think this amendment captures it.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I'll get back.
The chair recognizes Ranking Member Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Let me go back to the gentlelady's point from New York, whose amendment we're discussing. The fundamental issue, as I see it, is the issue of public health, period. And we're talking about primarily about communities, and this committee in the previous session dealt with the issue of environmental justice and frontline communities repeatedly, and managed to pass from committee a bill to deal with some of those issues. The gentlelady's amendment reinforces the issue of public health, and I think it is a critical one. We're talking about overburdened communities. We're talking about a legacy of public health issues. And before a project that would further layer negative public health consequences on these communities, they're assessing that. And so that we do no harm. We don't increase the harm. To me, it is about not only just disclosure, but it is about adding a layer of protection that does not exist for these communities at this point. And the communities that we went to and were able to visit, whether it was in Louisiana, in Cancer Alley, whether it was in indigenous communities affected by uranium mining and the consequences of that, whether it was in Los Angeles and the issue of air pollution and the concentration of industries provoking that, to coast communities that saw the erosion of their land and the huge economic losses of value to property over and over again. Those are all impacted communities. And to assess the public health and, yes, the economic consequences of a given region, I think is a pragmatic request so that we can make assessments. What we're talking about here is historic, but we're also talking about, in this amendment, about producing the evidence necessary to make the decisions that agencies must make. And if it is to do more harm and it is to overburden, then that is a decision that has to be rectified and changed. And I think that amendment speaks to that. It does not speak to drilling. It does not speak to how much energy is being generated. It talks about health impacts, and I think that is a fair and pragmatic request, and I support it entirely. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So with this amendment, I don't think any of us are opposed to actually having oversight to understand the health and safety with our fossil fuel productions. We want you to know the truth. We want you to see these reports. But as the gentleman from Wisconsin stated, there was a but in that. Not at this time. At this time, we aren't going to use that to go against fossil fuels, but we will use it later. We have been studying the science of fossil fuels. I worked in the oil and gas industry myself, and I know that no one produces energy better than we do, cleaner than we do. And instead, we have an administration right now that's begging Iran, begging Venezuela, begging Saudi Arabia, emptying our strategic petroleum reserves in the name of a midterm election
This is not in the name of public health and safety. This was in the name of an election to get fuel prices down $1 or $2 so they wouldn't have a complete decimation of their party, and they would still hold on to their levers of power. And thankfully, the American people saw through some of that. But I mean, just going through this, fossil fuel extraction is a significant driver of carbon pollution. If carbon pollution is your main aim, then let's talk about managing our forests, because one catastrophic wildfire emits more carbon emissions in a few short days than every vehicle in my state of Colorado running 24/7 for an entire year. So if carbon pollution is what you're after here, then let's get together and manage our forests. We have 6 billion standing dead trees in the western United States, all creating a massive tinderbox waiting to ignite. If you want to talk about water quality, then again, let's talk about managing our forests, because healthy forests have healthy watersheds. We can have water resiliency discussions and water storage discussions where we're seeing policies in states like California where they're dumping hundreds of billions of gallons of water into the ocean where they otherwise could have stored it. You know, if you're talking about low-income communities being impacted, well, let's talk about inflation. Let's talk about how our energy independence lowers inflation. And that's something that this administration surrendered on day one. This is something that they attacked immediately. We should be energy dominant right now. Our natural gas is 42% cleaner than Russia's. So why are you supporting Russia and their energy production and not America? Why are you pro-Putin when it comes to natural gas? Let's export liberty, export freedom around the globe, and send our clean LNG to these countries who are currently relying on dictators. And when you're talking about the indigenous communities, well, I invite you all to come to my district where one of our tribes has the first ever zero emissions net power natural gas fired plant. This is innovative. And this is what we should be doing with our other plants, our coal-fired energy plant in Craig, Colorado. I would love to see that transition into what our tribes are doing on their reservations, on their tribal land. And so come out and see what this looks like. See what this net zero energy production actually looks like. Even in Colorado, our coal is arguably the cleanest coal in the world. And climate extremists are sacrificing that at the altar of climate change. And look, I'm not here to deny climate change. I don't think anyone here is. It happens 4 times every year. We're very, very much aware of that. And you know, what we can do to lessen pollutants, we're here for it. That's why we are pro-natural gas. That's why we want to lower folks' energy bills. Have you seen the price of energy bills lately? That's because we're banning gas electronics, appliances. That's because we're pushing all of this green energy that's not efficient, it's not reliable, it's not renewable. And you know, I would love to see an actual study on our fossil fuel production, but not in this manner, because there are hidden elements in it. And for that reason, I will be opposing this amendment. And I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Magaziner from Rhode Island, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll yield to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you. You know, it continues to seem as though there is confusion about the substance of the amendment itself. Several references to a but. There is not one but in the language of this one paragraph amendment. Public health impact is a neutral term. It does not specifically cite negative impact. But importantly, many of us have traveled throughout the country to varying different sites of energy production. I have visited with families who say that they will be near an extraction site and at different times of the day their lungs start burning. I personally represent an area of the country that has some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the world. In a parallel committee that I also serve on, the Oversight Committee, we conducted certain investigations on the exposure of people to PFAS and the inordinate amount of reproductive cancers and other cancers that have been developed due to exposures nearby airports, military sites, etc. People deserve to know if they're being poisoned. People deserve to know if there's no health impact. People deserve to know if they're living near a place that is helping them or hurting them. And that is the basis of this one paragraph amendment. There have been so many times in history where people have been told by companies, by governments, that what they are near is safe, and they find out later on that they were not. And whether it is mountaintop extraction, whether it is PFAS exposure, whether it is fossil fuel extraction, we should not turn a blind eye to where there may be evidence that people may be encountering a health harm, especially when it comes to public policy. So that really is the substance of this amendment. The amendment itself does not speak to drilling. It does not speak to ending it. It does not speak to any of that. It is saying people, we deserve and we should study the health impacts of this production, including water quality, the health impacts of carbon pollution, and public health. That's what this says. I don't know what language other folks are reading, but the paragraph is right here. I believe it's been provided to everybody, and I believe that people deserve to know if they are safe or if they are unsafe when exposed to certain extraction sites. And with that, I yield back to Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you. And I'll just say again, this amendment does not strike a single word from the original text. So all of the topics that members of the majority have just run through, there's nothing to stop us from looking at any of them, from looking at the serious issues that you've raised, from looking at the wacky off-the-wall issues that you may raise. There's nothing to stop this committee from engaging in all of those topics. This is purely additive. Why would we not want to expand the body of information that we provide to the public and to this committee in its policymaking? Why do we want to bury our heads in the sand and deny people information about the impacts of extractive industries? Once again, nothing here strikes or cuts the ability to look at anything else. This is just about giving the American people the facts and giving us as a committee the facts so that we can make good decisions. And I'll just echo once again what others have said. We know that low-income communities, particularly communities of color, do bear the brunt of the climate crisis. We see it in asthma rates. We see it in cancer rates. We see it in a range of climate-related health outcomes. So why would we want to hide this information from the American people? This is purely additive to the scope of the committee's work. It does not eliminate our ability to look at any other topic. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the intent of the gentlelady's amendment. I understand that we should all be focused on health outcomes, and I think that all of us agree. The problem is that I think the premise, and in fact the black letter of the amendment actually is inaccurate, in that it suggests that that oil and gas production disproportionately affects a certain demographic of the population. There's actually an NAACP study. In fact, we had this debate in this committee last Congress, NAACP study that indicated actually that there were a lower percentage of communities of color located in proximity to energy production. I know that my home state of Louisiana, we have about 1/3 black population in our state. And when we went through and we looked at where the production was compared to the population, it wasn't even close in regard. And so saying that another way, there were many, I guess, white and what I refer to as Cajun folks proximate to where energy production was. Secondly, I think that what we should be doing is looking really globally. And as a matter of fact, if you look over the last few years, what we've seen is that the policies that are being carried out by the Biden administration, and unfortunately by this committee in the last Congress, we've actually seen adverse impacts on communities, and that we've seen communities have energy bills go up as a result of these policies, causing literally thousands and thousands of dollars of impacts on those who can least afford it, meaning their energy bills are going up, it's costing more to refuel their cars. And just to put a finer point on it, the last time we had Secretary Halan come testify before this committee, I asked her if she was aware of the volume of energy that we were importing from Russia, and she was unable to answer the question. And during the Biden administration in the first year, and I'm going to be wrong because I'm doing this from memory, but we had like a tripling or something, and again, give me wiggle room on that, of dependence upon Russian energy. If we all care about the global environment, which I know you do, and I do as well, we should be looking at ways to use U.S. resources in a way that actually reduces emissions. And for example, the Russian energy has about a 41% higher life cycle emissions than U.S. gas. Said another way, if we had simply taken 1 year of Russian gas that was going into the European Union and replaced it with U.S. gas, we would have had 218 tons, million tons of emissions reduction. And so, let me just circle back and close out here one more time. The Gentle Lady's amendment in regard to trying to protect or improve health of our communities, I'm in. I'm totally in. But I think that one, just the black letter of the amendment, I think has some things that are contrary to some data that we've had presented at this very committee. And secondly, I think that the scope is flawed and that we're looking only at the United States whenever the reality is using our resources. In fact, studies that have been done showing that OCS, Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas production, is either the lowest emissions per barrel or cubic foot of gas, or the second lowest. I believe two different studies. One said Saudi Arabia was the lowest, the other said ours was the lowest, if I remember correctly. And so we should be looking more holistically at how we actually improve global health outcomes, global emissions reduction, rather than looking myopically at one particular issue area that doesn't paint the true picture of global health. So I urge rejection of this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the argument of we cannot study something because other stuff is happening just misses the point that we are addressing federal lands here. And looking at the last sentence, which is the operable sentence, it says, the committee will perform oversight to understand how federal fossil fuel programs impact community health and safety, period. And so that's all that says. But I would also point out that when the chair of the Southern Ute tribe testified here, they do have an amazing, and I have visited the Southern Ute, they are a model program for a lot of what they do. But he also always pointed out that they are also pursuing renewable energy projects because they recognize that that is really important, and they are always very federal forward-looking. They're an amazing, have had amazing leadership over the years. I'd like to have the rest of my time. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, would you like to take it?
Thank you, Representative. You know, I think, again, when you look at the text here, while we see that there is historic disproportionate impact, including communities of color, it is not limited to communities of color. We also discuss low-income communities, as well as any frontline or vulnerable community, regardless of race. Historically, we have seen some of those disproportionate impacts, but as the representative noted, the active language here is, I would argue, is in the last sentence, which is that the committee will perform oversight to understand how federal fossil fuel programs impact community health and safety. There are no limitations. While there is past data indicating whether certain income levels of communities, certain frontline communities, this is really about assessing the health impacts on any community that would be potentially exposed to a health risk. And with that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
Gentlelady, yield back. Ms. Leger-Fernandez. Gentlelady yields back her time. Does any other member wish to be recognized? Mr. Bentz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to point out that I believe many of the elements that are contained in the proposed amendment are found in what is before us today, the plan. They're there. And I would hazard a wild guess that if this amendment doesn't pass, and I think it will fail, I hope it fails, we'll still hear a lot about it over the period of this committee. I'm just guessing. I've certainly heard a lot about it over the past 2 years, and we're going to hear a lot more about it as these issues are brought before our various committees. And I say that because it's obvious. When we get into the conversation, going back to the plan itself, Authorization and Oversight Plan, page 5, conservation versus preservation. Well, of course, someone can bring up why this particular issue is of importance. Federal land acquisition, access and recreation, I mean, on and on. But I wouldn't have spoken about for just calling out the fact that we're going to hear a lot more about this. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying I don't think we need the amendment to do it. I want to call up one other thing. The second sentence of the amendment says these burdens are disproportionately concentrated in communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous communities. Indeed, the studies indicate that that is the case. But the assertion or the prompt by this amendment would suggest that it's federal fossil fuel extraction that leads to that unfortunate outcome. And it actually, the studies, I was just going through them, suggest that really it's a result of truly, truly unfortunate housing policies in the past. Unfortunate, I think, is too simple a term, and other causes as opposed to merely federal fossil fuel extraction. With that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to yield back the rest of my time to you.
Gentleman yields back. Does anybody else wish to be recognized? And to be clear for Mr. Huffman, I'm recognizing myself for my statement on the amendment, which I do oppose. And the gentlelady almost had me with this amendment. You know, we all care about public health. We all care about safety. I think that's our duties as members of Congress. We have some areas on this committee where we can work on that. One of them is NEPA. We have jurisdiction over NEPA, and we have, I think, an obligation to fix NEPA so that it works for the country. But I think we would be getting into the jurisdiction of other committees when we start talking about public safety and health. We're getting into the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. It's fascinating discussion. You mentioned childhood asthma. I've seen reports that talk about poverty as the #1 cause of childhood asthma because of indoor air quality. So I would, as much as I would love to discuss those issues, I don't think they're areas that we have jurisdiction over on authorization and oversight. And again, we're approving a plan for authorization and oversight, and I think we have plenty to focus on, and I oppose this amendment. And with that, is there any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to request a recorded vote.
The recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. I recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, for the purpose of offering her amendment, and without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, in addition to building on the landmark successes of the last Congress, this committee should also provide strong oversight to ensure insular communities, which are particularly vulnerable to natural disasters, are not only recovering from disaster, but implementing resiliency measures to protect the environment and its natural resources. Today, I am offering an amendment to ensure that this committee continues its work on monitoring the recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, including the reconstruction of the electric grid. During the past year, this committee has engaged in crucial work to shed light on the situation on the island, and it is our moral duty to ensure that this work continues to be done. It is unthinkable that the only forum in this House of Representatives with jurisdiction over the affairs of Puerto Rico and the U.S. territories is refusing to address them. It seems that this leadership has forgotten that in the mainland United States, the Puerto Rican diaspora is close to 6 million and counting, and there are 3.3 million Puerto Ricans who are American citizens living on the island. Congress is the one vested with the authority over all Puerto Rico affairs, and is precisely this committee the one with the original jurisdiction over the territories. Puerto Rico's recovery is broader than achieving fiscal stability. This committee has a responsibility to oversee recovery efforts as a whole. Congress has authorized more than $80 billion in funding in response to multiple disasters in Puerto Rico, which are managed by more than 15 federal agencies. Even so, it seems that this committee intends to eliminate any supervision over these historic allocations. The current situation on the island merits strengthening political relations with Puerto Rico and ensuring that the federal agencies involved are serving Puerto Ricans in a fair, equal, and adequate manner. It will be devastating for Congress to disengage from achieving the stability of Puerto Rico's energy system. Managing future disasters starts now by making sure Puerto Rico has the tools it needs to get back on its feet. Dissociating from Puerto Rican affairs is contrary to building resilience and ensuring the best use of federal resources. Lack of oversight of these funds will set up Puerto Rico for failure. Refusing to gather testimony or to generate reports on the root issues that impact the recovery of the island are going to push us to be here 5 years down the line, revisiting the same issues over and over again. This committee must learn from the consequences of being disengaged and avoid another botched disaster response and lengthy reconstruction. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anybody else wish to be recognized to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Grijalva, you're recognized for 5
In
minutes.
support of the amendment, I think it complements the amendment that Commissioner Gonzalez Colon also had approved momentarily ago. It complements the fact that the complexity of what we've gone through and the people of Puerto Rico has gone through in this committee as the principal jurisdiction has gone through. I think her amendment continues the process of looking at not only what the fiscal plan is doing and not doing to the Puerto Rican people, it also looks at the reconstruction and the resource restoration issues that are also a big part of what that island and the people on that island have been asking for. I think it's consistent and it complements the original, the initial amendment that has already been approved regarding Puerto Rico. And with that, I urge the members to vote yes and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Seeing none, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Huffman, just so you're clear on that. I do oppose this amendment. While I appreciate the representative highlighting the ongoing island recovery efforts in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Fiona made landfall last year, again, this amendment is duplicative. The oversight plan clearly states that the committee will review the fundamental issues facing each of the territories and support and development of self-government and self-determination, economic development, and self-sufficiency through the private sector, accountability of federal funds, implementation, and enforcement of federal laws. Further, the oversight plan states that federal efforts should be focused first to ensure affordable and reliable energy systems are in place that meet the individual needs of each insular area. There is no limitation on committee's oversight activities of the electric grid in Puerto Rico or any of the insular areas. PREPA has been undergoing an immense change during the past few years with the privatization of PREPA's transmission and distribution, and just recently, PREPA's electrical generation function is steps closer to privatization. For too long, Puerto Ricans have struggled with affordable and reliable energy systems. More can be done to utilize an all of the above energy solution to meet the energy needs, and it's imperative that there is accountability of federal lands, implementation and enforcement of federal laws. I oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to do so. If there's no further discussion on the questions on the amendment offered by Ms. Velazquez, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Could we have a recorded vote?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on this amendment will be postponed. The unfinished business is on the request for recorded votes on amendments to the committee authorization and oversight plan. Members will record their votes using the electronic vote system. The question is on amendment designated Grijalva 1, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 21.
This amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment designated Ocasio-Cortez number 1, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? We're working on bigger monitors so that we'll be able to see that better.
Some of us won't admit it, but he's right.
Again, have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 21.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question is on the amendment designated Velazquez number 1, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their votes? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 16 and the nays are 21.
The amendment is not agreed to. Now I recognize Mr. Grijalva for a statement.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to, for the record, so that all the records are, the reference having to do with the NAACP fumes across the fence line, November 2017 report by the NAACP regarding health impacts of air pollution on oil and gas facilities on African-American communities, and just to set the record straight in terms of their findings. And second of all, to give notice of my intention to file supplemental additional dissenting or minority views on the measure just considered. I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all measures considered at this markup under House Rule 11, Clause 2L, and this notice extends to all members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to clarify, just because I know that the ranking member would not like to leave anything in the record that is not accurate, that same analysis found that there were 2% African Americans within a half-mile of the fence line of oil and gas facilities, which obviously isn't even close to the percentage of African Americans living in this country. So I know that during the hearing, there was a lot of discussion about trying to understand or digest that report, and I think it's very important that we have the facts on the table. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Graves. Let me just quote from the report. More than 1 million African Americans live within a half mile of existing natural gas and gas facilities, and the number is growing every year. As a result, many African American communities face an elevated risk of cancer due to the air toxic emissions from natural gas development and other industries. I don't know what's an acceptable 1% or 2% loss rate on anything, but nevertheless, I think the report makes all that abundantly clear that it is an impact.
And I want to thank the ranking member. I'll just say again, I'm not going to dispute the number that you just laid out, but it is lower than the percentage of African Americans in this country. Therefore, to suggest that it's disproportionate as per the black letter in the amendment would not be accurate.
Mr. Chairman, now I think I would be in order to question whose time we're talking on right now.
I'm done.
It's my time now. Without objection, the gentleman's submission is ordered, and we can discuss the merits and the data in it at a later point. The question is on approval of the Authorization and Oversight Plan as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the plan as amended is approved. A recorded vote has been requested. Members will record their vote using the electronic voting system. The clerk will open the vote. Have all members voted? The meeting is not adjourned yet. Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote?
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon has not been recorded.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? Hearing none, the clerk will close the vote and report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 16.
The Committee Authorization and Oversight Plan as amended is approved. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes to the documents the committee just adopted, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there is no further business, the committee stands adjourned.